Hello, this is Ben. I just wanted to make a video to go over my DIY floor refinishing process. I'm obviously not an expert, but this was a job that I took on for family reasons, which was to refinish my grandmother's floor. As you can see in that spot there, she was a wheelchair user and she sort of wore through the finish layer, so we decided to refinish the whole floor. It's important to note that this is a parquet floor, which is the type of flooring that they sort of glue panels together of pieces of wood and then place them together, so you end up with issues like water damage, which peeled up, so I glued those back together as much as I could. Separation between the segments, the different squares basically, and I tried to fill the gaps between those sections. After finishing the prep work, making sure the floor was as good as I could make it, I went ahead and rented a large pad sander. After doing some research, I kind of figured that was the best option for someone who was a beginner, which I think worked out pretty well. The main tip that I was given was to make sure I was working in straight lines. So as you can see here, I was trying to avoid turning. The idea being that as you work through the grits progressively, what you're doing is removing the lines from the previous grit. So you want to make sure you make as few of those lines as possible. And because this is like a more of a side-to-side linear motion, it's not like a random orbit sander, so you can end up with lines if you're not careful. I started out with 20 grit pad and moved up to a 36 grit pad, then a 60 grit pad, then an 80 grit pad, then a 120 grit pad, which in hindsight was probably overkill, probably too much sanding, but I thought it was important. One of the main issues that I ended up having was this is a 15 amp sander operating on a 15 amp circuit, which meant I had several times where I would be starting the machine up and that surge would trip the circuit. Eventually I made it through and moved on to the finishing process. This was sort of start and go process because of my own schedule and the schedule for the sale. What I was trying to do is do a seal coat basically to get something on the floor to prevent any damage from people still walking on the floor, while also being able to give me a couple days so that I could come back to it and finishing the floor. Which brings me to the point I want to make about the timing of how all this worked out. This ended up being a thing that we sort of talked about doing and didn't end up deciding to do until the last minute, which meant that a lot of the decisions that I made for this project were made sort of with timing in mind. So that's going to definitely play into the results, but a lot of it was more just me being inexperienced with floor finishing. As I'm sure most woodworkers are familiar, there's times where you get voluntold to do projects that are not really in your skill set because you're a woodworker and the project is loosely related to wood. All of that aside, the project ended up taking about a little less than 10 hours in total. That's about the time that I think I've spent actually working on it. So between coats, I wanted to make sure I did a nice sanding. Like I said, this sat for a couple days. It's been walked on. People have been, doing other projects. So this is where I think my biggest finishing mistake happened. I tried to do what ended up being a rather thick coat of finish. This is a 3-gallon pail of polyurethane, specially designed for flooring. I tried thinning it out, but it's such a big can. I didn't have enough mineral spirits to thin it out enough, I don't think, which ended up being an issue. We'll talk about it at the end here, but it looked good on the day, so I wasn't too concerned about it, but it ended up, I think, being part of the issues that I ended up having with the final result. This was another decision that was heavily affected by the timing of things. I wanted to make sure that if I wanted to and had the time, ended up having time, I would be able to get a additional coat in before the first open house. That didn't end up happening, didn't really end up having the opportunity time-wise anyway. So I probably should have spent more time because this ended up being the finished coat. So I probably should have spent more time just sort of making it as good as possible. Also want to point out that I think I tried to use this lamb's wool applicator pad, which was terrible. You can see me picking up pieces of it as it disintegrated as I was working with it. That also didn't help. tons of things in this project didn't go the way that I was hoping they would go. I'm kind of repeating myself, but I want to emphasize that I think the issue was that I was trying to finish this like it was a tabletop and not like a floor, which I really wouldn't have experience with, and that was part of the issue. So that ended up being sort of, in hindsight, part of the problem. But the results don't look terrible from this sort of walking height video that I recorded after the fact. You can see some issues, but once you get up close, you can see a lot of the texture issues, the sawdust or sanding particles left on the floor, the debris. You can see the separation, that wood filler that I tried to apply to fill the gaps there. And then obviously there's the discussion of cost, which is sort of a difficult one, because if you take the hours out of it and you take the supplies, you factor in the idea that I probably used less than half of that can of polyurethane. You know, the numbers look a lot better, but I wanted to try to give a more realistic, like, you know, this is the amount of time, this is the amount of money that this would have cost if you tried to take this project on yourself. Please feel free to leave any comments, questions. Please like the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.